Nowhere else in Rosendale does the past echo with the same melancholy sentiments that we find in Grane. For it was here that a once thriving community were gradually forced, by the relentless water authorities, to up sticks and leave, a place they had inhabited for generations. In just 76 years, from a prosperous peak in about 1850 to the removal of St. Stephen's Church in 1926, the village's population dropped from some 600 hard-working weavers, quarry workers and farmers to maybe a dozen individuals, struggling to hold out and gradually succumbing to the changes. Today, many visitors park beneath the trees for a walk around Clough Head Reservoir, completely unaware of the lost village in their midst. Its remains are subtle, but a rewarding day can be spent seeking them out and making sense of how life really was here. Across the main road is what remains of Crow Trees, the oldest part of Grane Village. Only one property remains, Crow Trees Cottage, which originally backed onto a 17th century yeoman's farm. This stood on the right, Haslingden side, as viewed from the old church site. The older part of this farm was a long building with mullioned windows, which eventually became the Seven Stars Pub, Grane's best-known watering hole. Only the old steps at the rear remain of this historic site, which had vanished by the 1960s. Beyond and slightly higher up are the remains of Biggins buildings, better known as Treacle Row, though nobody is sure if this stems from the habit of subsisting on treacle butties, common at the time, or the alleged proximity of the legendary treacle mines. The inhabitants of this mid-19th century included Dougal, Fatty, Fudge, Mush, Coil Bob, Duddy Hoyle and the legendary Skinning Tom. One day Tom was having a drink in the Duke of Wellington with the engine driver who worked the locomotive from the quarry to Grane siding, and he asked him how fast his engine could go. When he was told about 20 miles an hour, Tom promptly bet the driver that he could beat the engine down the siding, provided he was given 30-yard starts. The driver, of course, accepted, and the entire village of Grane turned out to watch what they assumed would be a foregone conclusion. But Tom had other ideas. Once the locomotive set off, he took up a place not at the side, but in the middle of the track. The engine driver daren't speed up in case he killed him, so Skinning Tom ran home an easy winner. He later offered the driver a chance to win his money back by offering to race his whippet, so long, he insisted, as it runs the same way as me. Again, the village turned out, and at the starting signal, the dog set off like a bullet, while Tom simply ran backwards. Needless to say, the engine driver had to pay up a second time. Tom was one of Grane's wiliest characters. There are still substantial remains of Biggins, including old cellars and cubbyholes, well worth exploring. On the opposite, Blackburn, side of Crow Trees Cottage, a distinctive stretch of wall fronting the main road is all that remains of the Church of England School, built in 1836. This also served as an Anglican place of worship years before St. Stephen's came along. Its best-known headmaster, Mr. J.T. Pilling, made headline news in the mid-1890s by leaving his job to seek his prospects at the Klondike Gold Rush in northwest Canada. To prepare for the ordeal, he spent the entire winter in a tent on the hills of Grane, wearing nothing more than his vest and underpants. Grane was never short of eccentrics. The original valley road through Grane ran eastwards from Turf Pits and Pike Low and along Stony Rake to the village before turning north at Crow Trees. Here it passed Lane End, where the old route crossed the 1810 Turnpike Road, a cluster of buildings soon springing up around the junction. The old highway beyond can still be traced behind what was the Seven Stars and along the hillside to Heap Clough, where it crossed the stream and curved around the hillside towards Haslingden Hall. It's fascinating to walk along this ancient route, and I wonder whose steps you could be walking in. There are wells, boundary stones, and amazing views across the valley, beyond to Musbury Tor, Musbury Heights, and Haslingden Wood. It's a historian's paradise. Haslingden Wood. This picturesque corner of Haslingden is named after the Haldens, the most powerful and influential family in the area for hundreds of years. During the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, a Robertus de Haslingden was also referred to as Robert de Holden, stemming from the Old English Hol Denu, or Robert of the Hollow Valley. His son Adam was the first of the Holdens to be granted land in the township by Henry de Lacy, after its previous tenant had forfeited it through an act of felony for which he was hanged. They didn't mess about in the Middle Ages. Adam's successors subsequently built Haslingden Hall, the last version of which dated from the 15th century. It stood at the northwest corner of the present cemetery, opposite the farm, and was senselessly demolished around 1900. The lineage of the Holdens continued over 500 years, with the last being a Ralph Holden, who died heirless in 1792. During the 19th century, the building fell into a ruinous state, and a proposal for an extension to the cemetery was an excuse for it to go. The most famous Holden story concerns Henry, the great-great-great-grandson of Adam de Holden, who married Marjorie Haslingden in the 1460s. The Wars of the Roses were at their full height, and Marjorie's brother hoped to seek refuge at the Hall, only to discover that her husband supported the opposing side. Instead, he hid in a cave nearby, to which his sister would secretly smuggle food and information. Her regular absence made Henry suspicious, and after following her one day and seeing them meet, he believed she was being unfaithful with another man. He drew his sword and killed his brother-in-law, but plucky Marjorie stepped in between the two men at the last second and was slain by her own husband. The cave, probably no more than a rocky recess in the Haslingden flagstone, now lies submerged beneath the waters of Haslingden Wood Reservoir. For years it was known as Madge Lum, and Marjorie's ghost has been seen in the area on many occasions. The reservoir, dating from 1841, was the first of the 3 built at Grane, but was never used for drinking water. William Turner of Higher Mill, Helmshire, and John Bowker of Irwell Vale decided on its construction to provide a regular water supply for their mills. These days a wildlife sanctuary, its water is occasionally pumped into Ogden Reservoir to sustain the levels. Seen from the north and backed by Musbury Tor, is one of the finest sights in the Rosendale Valley. Across the road is the cemetery, home to the White Lady of Grane. A number of ghostly sightings have been reported here in recent years, with sceptics blaming the consumption of ale at the Holden Arms pub. One decidedly sober observer was a bus driver who, on a dark rainy night in 1969, was on his last run from Blackburn and ready to turn in at the depot. His one remaining passenger was stood talking to him at the wheel when together they saw a woman in a headscarf at the bus stop by the cemetery, holding out her hand. The driver immediately indicated and stopped, and the doors swung open, only for nobody to climb on board. Puzzled, both the driver and passenger got off and looked around, concerned that they might have actually collided with the woman. There was nowhere she could have gone in the few seconds it took them to leave the vehicle, and they shrugged and continued their journey, the realisation only dawning on the driver when he was told of regular encounters near the cemetery. Several people have reported seeing the lady in the area over the past half a century, often carrying 2 bags of shopping. This suggests that she is not Madge Haslingden, but a more recent spirit from among the tombstones. Beyond the reservoir lies Lay's End Farm, dating from 1719, and yet another site linked to ghostly activity. Strange footsteps were often heard in the farmhouse during the 19th century. Close by is the site of the ancient Haslingden Cross, marked by an unremarkable hump in the hillside to the west of a telegraph pole behind the farm. Until 1914, the massive stone base of the cross stood here before local MP Major Halstead had it moved to Victoria Park in Haslingden. It now rests, rather forlornly and without a scrap of information, below the clock tower. Nobody is sure why the cross itself vanished. It may have been destroyed as far back as the Reformation, or during the Puritan period, when religious symbolism was seen to be Catholic and ruthlessly destroyed. We will never know for certain. The exact purpose of the Haslingden Cross is also unclear. It appears to have been placed close to a major spring and may well have overlooked a long-vanished well, but it is interesting how low down in the landscape it was erected, with comparison, for example, to the Pilgrim's Cross on Holcombe Moor. These crosses may have stood on a major route along the hills to Whalley Abbey, a frequent place of pilgrimage at which travellers were cleansed of their sins in medieval times. The name of the farm, Lay's End, may offer a further clue. Was it that Haslingden Cross was situated just below a sight line in the landscape when viewed from Holcombe Moor? Once they reached the cross at the end of the straight line of Lay, or Lay's End, did travellers then turn 90 degrees westward along the Old Valley route towards Holy Cross, Alley Cross, before continuing through Blackburn and Accrington to Whalley? I think it is highly possible. There may be a reason for this diversion. Instead of following the most direct route northwards, the latter would have taken the pilgrim through the heathen ritual landscape of 13 Stone Hill, which we can assume was still a prominent feature in the medieval period, and may have been considered unlucky or even dangerous to the soul. It is, of course, likely that the pilgrimage route to Whalley utilised already ancient pathways established thousands of years before, but the way that the cross sites are aligned make the proposal very conceivable. Avoid the places of the devil and keep the soul free of influences. You can see what they may have been thinking. Why Major Halstead decided to move the cross base is anyone's guess, but it seems a strange thing to do to a stone that had stood there for centuries. As they say in Lancashire, it must have been one heck of a job to shift it. Pay the stone your respects in Victoria Park and think of the legions of people who have stopped by it over many hundreds of years. Like me, you will wish you could pick it up and put it back where it really belongs. The building of Ogden Reservoir sounded the final death knell for the community of Grane, a village that had been happy and prosperous in the 1850s with its own shops as well as 2 schools, a chapel and a parish church. First Holden Wood, then Clough Head Reservoir had been built in the 19th century, removing some of the best grazing pasture from the villagers and seeing more and more of their land taken by the Bury and District Water Board. But Ogden was the nail in the coffin. The owners of the Haslingden Grane Manufacturing Company at Clough Head Mill, one of the chief employers of the Graners, were given a notice to quit as the Water Board announced plans for the 3rd reservoir. They had already bought up most of the surrounding farmland, intent on removing the leases, and the Graners began to dwindle out of a place their families had lived and worked in for generations. The mill dated back to the 1830s. Although there had been older buildings on the site, it was largely rebuilt as a cotton mill by Richard Roscoe, a well-known local quarry owner. At its peak, during the 1870s, it had 12,020 spindles and 29 looms. The prospect of its remains disappearing underwater at a depth of 15.25 metres, 50 feet, must have been galling indeed for the locals, still smarting from the loss of their best pasture land. When the reservoir was completed in 1912, not only was the mill submerged, but also the farmsteads of Lower Scars and Broad Holden Lodge, two of the oldest in the district, dating back to the Middle Ages. The remains of Broad Holden Mill, a water-powered carding mill of 1795, were also drowned forever. There has long been a tall story that the village of Grane itself lies beneath the reservoir, including the church, prompting many visitors to suspect they've even heard the tolling of bells beneath the water. Several sources, in fact, wrongly state that the village lies submerged, when in fact it stood on a higher ground to the west. The rapid expansion of Bury, 11 miles away, and its need for water was considered far more important to the authorities than the livelihoods of the Graners. In the years after Ogden's construction, the last of the farmers were forced to leave, the risk of human contamination of the drinking water causing the final push. By that time, in 1925, St. Stephen's Church had been pulled down, stone by stone, and relocated at 3 lanes ends, over a mile nearer to Haslingden. Ogden had made the final kill. The reservoir's impressive dam is 19.8 metres, 65 feet high, and it holds 330 million gallons. It was largely built by Irish navvies, and Navvy Row is still the nickname given to Park Lane View in Helmshire today. During the scorching summer of 1984, I remember seeing the remains of a building sticking out of the water, possibly Clough Head Mill. If this was unsettling, the events of 4 years before were even more so. On the 14th of August 1980, Andrew Nightingale and his friend turned up at the reservoir for a spot of late-night fishing. It was, as on my first visit, pouring with rain, which they knew helped bring the fish to the surface. A few minutes after casting, they noticed a glowing red circle made up of 9 points of light on the surface of the water. Believing this to be a reflection of something above, they peered skywards, but saw nothing. They looked back, but the lights had gone, and each probably believed he had been imagining things. Seconds later, as Randall's 2002 relates, they were back, now pulsing in rhythm and clearly rising from beneath the water. The men immediately dropped their expensive equipment and fled the scene, Nightingale later saying, "There was no way I was going back until daylight." Was this yet another of the supposed UFO sightings in this well-known centre of activity, or was it just one of the many ghostly encounters that have been reported around the mysterious Grane Valley? Opinions have varied, and of course, the realists and sceptics have found other explanations, but it is strange that my suspicions about Ogden Reservoir were justified 3 years after my memorable visit there. I can still see the chilling dark waters and hear the music from that first encounter, even today. Stone Hill. This seemingly drab wedge of moorland should be the most spectacular prehistoric complex in the Rosendale Valley. As the name implies, a ring of 13 stones once crowned the exposed summit here, and we know it was of impressive dimensions. Documentary evidence is lacking as to the exact when and why it was destroyed, but it must have been before the mid-19th century, as the circle is not marked on the 1844 map of Haslingden. Fascination with the occult, coupled with a renewed interest in all things antiquarian, probably made the church and local landowners remove such sites, thus upholding Christian beliefs. What became of the massive megaliths that made up the circle is similarly unclear, but they may have been blown up, hammered and buried, or simply broken up and used for other purposes. All was seemingly forgotten until the early 1970s, when local historian Chris Aspin discovered the hollows or depressions that had once held the stones, a short distance south of the hill's summit. Some of these, being over 5 feet, 1.52 metres across, gave the idea of the immense size of the boulders erected here in the early Bronze Age, some 4,000 years ago. Chris organised a full-scale survey carried out by M.K. Eckersall in 1972. This indeed revealed sockets for 13 stones arranged in an ellipse, with long axis aligned northwest/southeast, and 88.5 feet, 26.9 metres in diameter. The distance corresponded to 32.5 megalithic yards, each yard being linked to the average pace of an adult human. The stones were irregularly arranged, with 5 of the 13 being on the east side and 8 on the west. Most remarkable was the precise positioning. The circle's centre was painstakingly chosen so that a range of astronomical phenomena could be observed from it, with relation to surrounding landscape features. Men must have known these hills intimately, as well as the movements and variations of the celestial bodies. The long axis, for example, aligns with the northwest setting of the midsummer sun over Bleasdale Fell in the Forest of Bowland, and with the winter solstice sunrise at southeast. If the 13 stones were numbered clockwise from the north, then stones 1, 2, 7 and 8 formed a rectangle arranged north-northeast/south-southwest, along which the full moon, when at its most northerly rising, could be viewed from the circle's centre. As if this wasn't enough, the south-southwest view along this axis also saw the full moon at its lowest setting declination. Every metonic cycle of 18.6 years appeared to roll along and down the slope of Hoglow Pike before disappearing beneath the horizon. This is truly mind-boggling stuff, allowing us to realise the real tragedy of the site's destruction. Heapclough is flanked by the huge Jamestown quarry, gradually swallowing the field seen on mid-20th century maps. It was opened shortly after the war, being worked for stone by George Phillipson of Bromley Cross, until its closure in 1961, after which it was reopened for aggregate. Each summer, the current owners face an ongoing battle with persistent wild swimmers, who seem to get a kick out of ignoring the increasingly graphic warning signs to plunge into the depths of its flooded excavations. Even if you survive the shock of the first plunge, screams the sign, hidden machinery and weeds could pull you under, yet still they do it. The abandoned Troy Quarry lies just to the east, its pools and cliffs bounded by shrubs and heather, giving it an oddly beautiful appearance. Intrepid rock climbers tackle a variety of routes up the most challenging sandstone faces, the Pink Edge, Siamese Slab, and for the connoisseur, the Super Snatch. The quarry dates back to the 1880s and was owned by Hargreaves and Bolton, and eventually George Phillipson, ending its days when Jamestown originally closed in 1961. The various pools and dikes are a valuable wildlife habitat, with breeding toads, newts and dragonflies, though, as at Jamestown, a persistent species of mammal dominates, proceeding in the summer months. The historic old highway to Oswaldtwizzle cuts up between the quarries to emerge at the ruins of Prieston Taxed, marked by 2 prominent sycamores. This could be a site of great antiquity, the name stemming from Priest's Intake, or landing clothes from Haslingden Moor, presumably by a man of that name, or even a monk. The site has been painstakingly researched by Jackie Ramsbottom and Brian York. As far back as 1626, a baptism in St James Church, Haslingden, records an Alice Lang, daughter of George Lang, de Priest Intakes. By the 1881 census, a James Raffall had moved to the farm from Hawes in Wensleydale with his wife, 2 children, and elderly father William. The stone industry in Rosendale drew people from far and wide. A George Metcalf Parker lived in Prieston Tax in 1911, and the building seems to have fallen into ruins following the construction of Ogden Reservoir. The farms were then cleared to avoid any risk of pollution to the catchment. The most striking remnants is the old well, superbly carved from a single block of stone. Lying on an ancient route and with links to early reclaimed land from the moor, I can't help thinking the priest may derive from a connection with the monks of Whalley Abbey. The nearby presence of Haslingden Cross and alley Holy Cross may be more than a coincidence. The Rosendale Way turns off this ancient route just below Prieston Tags and follows another old track which developed along the edge of Haslingden Moor, where land was gradually enclosed from about 1620. It passes below far Prieston Tags and reaches the ruin of Black Hill, now perched pitifully on the edge of Jamestone Quarry, by which, I hope, they will never be swallowed. This farm was once home to another of Grane's great characters, Edgar Maudsley, known to locals as the Mayor of the Grane, no doubt in jest at the way he ruled the roost with his devious and cunning ways. Oud Edgar was born around 1870 and was said to have been living at Black Hill with his sister Alice around the time of the First World War. They appeared to have moved to Grane from a farm at Grindleton near Gisburn. Edgar has been described as a semi-vagrant and was apparently a self-professed retired horse thief, whiskey spinner, liar, drinker, poacher and blackmailer. A famous photograph shows him in a trilby, knee-length boots and a drab coat, with a sack on his back in which he collected anything he could to get his grubby fingers on. He carried his walking stick with its handle upside down, probably to hook onto anything that took his fancy. One of his notorious habits was to call in the grain co-op, take a bite out of the eatables on display, and then promptly offer to remove the damaged goods at a lower price. Children playing skipping games used to chant the rhyme, "There is a man from Haslingden who's called the Mayor of Grane. No matter where you see him, he's always dressed the same. He has a trilby hat on and spats up to his knees, and if you go too near him, he'll cover you in fleas." By the 1920s, Edgar had moved to occupy both Grane Cottage and the adjoining Bird in Hand pub. The pub, demolished in 1938, was adjoined to the cottage on the southern side and can be seen from the slightly raised gable. It was known as Little Edward's, after the long-serving landlord Edward Taylor. In 1923, Edgar Maudsley was in the dock, charged with converting the Bird in Hand into 4 dwellings without a sniff of planning permission. The neighbours complained how this doss house saw its tenants regularly using the back garden as an open-air privy. Maudsley had earlier clashed with the law over cruelty to pigs in transport to Bolton, being drunk and disorderly, and for breach of contract, which seems to have become a regular habit. In 1931, the Mayor of Grane apparently had the court in stitches when he was asked to explain an unlicensed dog, to which he protested his innocence, saying, "It ain't my fault it follows me about." Details about Edgar after this are vague, but an Edgar Maudsley who died in Amordanus, Preston, in January 1952 matches his birth date exactly, and has a good chance of being him. His sister had died as an invalid in Blackburn some 11 years before. Both Maudsley may have had unfinished business before he left the world. Alan Pickering, antiques dealer and keen historian of the Holdenwood Antiques Centre at Grane, can bear testimony to that. He recently renovated Grane Cottage, after which his wife often noted an uncomfortable feeling that came across her as she walked near the landing window. Just after Christmas 2012, Their 3-year-old grandson was staying with them, and after playing upstairs one evening, he suddenly appeared in the living room. Alan asked him if he was all right, to which he replied, "Yes, but I don't like that grumpy Father Christmas. He keeps telling me to go downstairs." Alan, the last person to believe in any ghostly presence, then asked his wife, "Did we put a Father Christmas in that room, or did he take one up?" They both went to where their grandson pointed, but there was just an empty chair. The little boy described an old man with a beard, who had been watching him playing and kept complaining about him. Other incidents followed. Alan and his wife were due to travel to Cornwall one summer and had decided to depart just after midnight to avoid the traffic. They tried to snatch a few hours' sleep on the sofa before the drive, but unable to nod off and leaving his wife asleep. Alan headed for his bed, where he hoped he might at least get a couple of hours. He had been lying several minutes semi-awake when he clearly felt the bed move and a figure get in beside him. He assumed it was his wife and drifted off. Only 2 hours later, when he went downstairs, he saw his wife still asleep on the sofa. Did the strange event dawn on him? He was convinced he had been awake, hadn't been dreaming, and that the person was breathing beside him. Alan also reported his dog barking frantically at the kitchen stable door one day in an aggressive manner that he hadn't witnessed before. He assured the dog there was nothing there, and after closing the upper part of the door, there was an enormous bang from behind it. Thinking something had have fallen, Alan entered the kitchen to find nothing. Not long after these incidents, a former owner of Grane Cottage met Alan at the antiques centre and explained to him that the house he had converted was haunted. An old man had frequently been seen there over the years, and Alan was able to relate how his grandson had indeed encountered him in the top-storey room. One person who visited as a child many years ago described a man appearing in one of the bedrooms. "We were so frightened that Dad had to take us out. It is reasonable to assume the ghost is that of old Edgar Maudsley himself. Alan certainly thinks so." The Grane Cottage has a lower section attached on the southern side that may have been a toll house on the old road to Osseltwizzle. Behind the cottage, set at an angle, is a very old building that may have been a shepherd's hut. The cottage itself probably once had a loom shop on the top storey, and regardless of ghosts, it is one of the most interesting buildings still standing in the Grane Valley. Above it, to the left of the old road, the silted-up lodge and crumbling walls mark the position of Heap Clough, or Paradise Mill, where the Old Valley Road to Blackburn crossed the route to Osseltwizzle. Established in 1848 by Joseph Pilling and Co., became a 3-storey spinning mill with a workforce of 200, and was later run by the Heap Clough Manufacturing Company. Its short life ended in 1901 when the Bury and District Joint Water Board purchased the land and demolished it to prevent pollution of their new Ogden Reservoir. The firm was then transferred to Haslingden. The unusual mound in the field between the mill site and the back of Virgin's Row has a story to tell. This was the control bunker of a World War II starfish, or special fire site. From this position, fires could be started in decoy railway trucks on a short section of line on the moor above, between Priest and Tax and Far Priest and Tax farms. The idea was to pick up the first wave of bombers heading for Accrington's factories and ignite the trucks to fool further waves into thinking this remote spot was in fact the target area. As far as is known, the site was never actually activated, and there was a similar one designed to protect the munitions works at Chorley between Pikelaw and Rushy Hill, about 3 kilometres to the west. We can't leave Heap Clough without a look at Virgin's Row. It is remarkable that these lovely old cottages, dating from the 18th century, have survived the general desecration of properties in the Grane Valley, and equally so that nobody is sure where the name comes from. Roughwell 2009 notes that each two-storey lean-to at the rear is said to have housed a hand loom. Preserved in the garden of the gable end that once adjoined the bird in hand is the 1836 date stone of the old Grane schoolhouse at Crow Trees, which, like the pub, disappeared in the 1960s. One theory for the name of the row is that it was once inhabited solely by spinsters, and if many of the local males were as unsavoury in their habits as Oud Edgar Maudsley himself, who could possibly blame them? The name Grane stems from the Old Norse grain, meaning a small valley branching off a larger one, describing the way in which the River Ogden feeds into the glaciated valleys of Haslingden and the River Irwell. Man's activities in the valley date back to the Mesolithic and Neolithic, with evidence in the form of flint and chert tools from Clough Head and Hog Law Pike. Many of the ruined farmsteads are believed to stand on earlier medieval sites. Woodland clearance and the development of the cloth trade saw many more people living in the valley by the mid-18th century, but it was only after the Blackburn to Haslingden Turnpike Road in 1810 that the true development of the village began. The present-day car park stands on the site of a long line of weavers' cottages, known as Chapel Row, and gradually developed between 1810 and 1820. The foundations were still there when I was a kid, but there is little trace today. Over 50 people lived in the row at the 1851 census, mainly of the Holden and Lonsdale families. The buildings took their name from their attachment to the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, which stood at the northern end. Built in 1815 at the cost of £700, it was the first official place of worship in Grane, reflecting the growing population of the community. The chapel became known for its annual Good Friday tea parties, when hundreds of people would turn up for festivities stretching into the surrounding fields. Even in 1923, long after the village's decline, 720 people flocked to the event, a record strangely ironic in the circumstances. The chapel held on to its dwindling congregation admirably until 1955 and was sadly demolished a year later. It is touching today to wander amongst the graves inside the iron railings, the vacant space gradually returning to nature. But with such fabulous names as Holden still starkly staring from the lichen and moss-encrusted tombstones, Henry Roughwell, blanket and flannel manufacturer, who probably gave his name to nearby Roughwell Fold, is also here. Several of the graves highlight the shocking infant mortality rate in 19th century Lancashire, many children not making it to 5 years old. It is a place tinged with sadness, the already cryptic nature reinforced by the presence of both toads and adders. The chapel had a 3-storey schoolhouse attached on the southern side, part of which was once a Sunday school and later a day school, until inspectors closed it in 1871. Apparently the teaching was feeble and the pupils were out of control. There is always something anti-authoritarian about the characters of the Grane, and the children don't seem to have been any different. Continuing along the path to the main road, the old village well is passed on the left, and on the right, a bird hide has been developed from the foundations of Lane End, where there was a farmhouse and cottages. The remains of a walled track will be seen descending from there into the trees, leading to what was Phineas Fold, a small hamlet arranged around a square. It is interesting that the name Phineas derives from the Hebrew Pinchas, meaning mouth of the serpent, with there being so many adders living in the Grane area. The 1851 census saw 22 people here, of the Barnes and Taylor families, along with William Allison, a schoolmaster. Very little remains except old stone gateposts and moss-covered boulders, gradually disappearing now that we have clean air to encourage plant growth. Nothing appears to have lived here for centuries. Beyond Phineas Fold, the keen eye can pick out the remains of 3 cottages which face south. These had loom shops upstairs and included a joinery, grocer's shop, a butcher's, and a notorious unlicensed beer shop known simply as the Grane. The 1851 census lists Henry Walsh as the brave beer retailer who would have had a job on his hands controlling the thirsty quarry workers, farmers and weavers who once descended on his little pub, bless him. Beyond the ruins, the old lane through Phineas Fold continues into what is now a field, with isolated trees and stone walls marking the position of Holt Clough Farm. This was rebuilt by textile manufacturer Ellis Ratcliffe in about 1810, roughly at the same time as Chapel Row. Beyond it, the twin walls of this old route are brought to an abrupt end as they meet the wall bordering the current A6177 running above them. This is a rather eerie situation, again seemingly symbolic of the end of a once thriving community. Nowhere is the loss felt more strongly than at the former site of St. Stephen's Church, a few yards to the east. The building of this church between 1863 and 1867 really marked the peak of Grane as a village, though the first of the major reservoirs had just been built and the death knell was already within earshot. The ensuing decline was a rapid one, with the church standing for a little over 60 years before being moved, stone by stone, to its present position at 3 lane ends. Now a thriving antique centre and tea room. Once their church had gone, the Graners must have really known their time was up. There is something remarkably spooky about the old church site, beautifully pastoral though it is. The large rectangular mound marking the spot where generations of old Graners came to pray, worship and bury their dead is marked by a cross in Celtic design, giving information about the 1926 Exodus. Beyond, forgotten gravestones linger beneath shady sycamores, and a number of people have reported ghostly activity here over the years. A Facebook group member wrote to me saying that on one occasion, when she was laying flowers by the grave of a relative here several years ago, she saw a bearded man under the trees. He was apparently doing the same thing. She was only a few feet from him as she laid her wreath, stood up, and he was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps it was old Jonathan Howarth himself, the infamous whiskey distiller, who still managed to get himself underneath a finely engraved tombstone here, his last triumph, it would seem, over the authorities. Returning to Clough Head car park, the lane below it, leading off towards the reservoir, passes, on the right, 2 of the last remaining cottages in Grane Village. They date from the late 19th century. When I was a young lad, they were derelict, and we used to venture inside their empty shells, but they have been restored, strangely holding on amidst the surroundings of a long-dead community, now cloaked in brambles and lost beneath a canopy of pines and sycamores. It's a lovely place, but definitely tinged with sadness. Birds, ironically, in melodic song as nature, perhaps cruelly, lays the ghosts of Grane to rest. Beyond, on the left, was the hamlet of Clough Head, with the restored Clough Head barn and house. No less than 32 people lived in this little corner of Grane in 1851. including the famous Roscoe family of quarry owners, Lawrence's wife Nancy being affectionately known as the Queen of the Grane. They did much to subsidise the building of the schoolhouse at Crowtrees. Just before Clough Head barn, a snicket leads through the trees past the southern limit of the old village at Roughwell Fold. Here stood a farmhouse and cottages with another 14 people in 1851, including farmer John Durden, power loom weaver and wool spinner, no doubt employed at Clough Head Mill, which now lies submerged beneath the waters of Ogden Reservoir. Grane is by turns stunningly beautiful, thought-provoking, mysterious, otherworldly, spiritual, ghostly, and endlessly fascinating. I have explored its history, recorded its wildlife, and visited and revisited every nook and cranny of this wonderful place since I was 8 years old. That's getting on for nearly 50 years, and I can only say that I'm seriously addicted to Haslingden Grane and its valley. With Crochet Booth, it remains perhaps my favourite place on earth, and as us Rosendalians are famously set in our ways, I can't see that ever changing. The next day and I'm back at Haslingden Grane to find that moonshiner's house. It's a lot less windy today. My first video was kind of ruined. Just wind. It's called Bentley House. I had a look on the OS map. I tried on my phone but the arrow kept switching directions when I got near it. It was quite weird. So let's try again. About 5,000 years ago, broad-leaved woodland covered most of Haslingden Grane, but much of this has disappeared by 1507, when the laws which preserved the ancient forest of Rosendale as a hunting ground for noblemen were abolished, and people were allowed to settle and farm the land. From then the activities of farming, quarrying, weaving, forestry and water catchment have all left their mark. In the 1800s, the Grane was the home of 1,300 people who inhabited the scattered hamlets and farms of the valley. At this time, there was a school, chapel, shop, pub, 3 mills, and the church of St. Stephen. The area became depopulated following the building of the Ogden Reservoir in 1912 because the purity of the water supply took priority and people were encouraged to leave, thus reducing the risk of pollution. The Church of St. Stephen was demolished and rebuilt further down the valley in 1926. The people who lived in the valley were known locally as Graners. They made their living in various ways, including farming, weaving, and some of them by illegally distilling whiskey. The whiskey spinners, as they were known, carried on their trade for about 150 years in secret chambers and passages hidden in the buildings. How many of these whiskey spinners there were will never be known, as few were ever caught. Quarrying also contributed to the local economy. The rugged outline of Musbury Heights Quarry, which closed in the 1920s, can be seen across the valley. The stone here is a hard sedimentary rock of the Millstone Grit series that was laid down over 300 million years ago. Sets, curbs and flagstones were produced from the quarried stone, which was brought down into the valley by a tramway and then onto the railway near Haslingden. From 1897 to 1901, a brickworks was in operation close to what is now Clough Head car park and picnic site. Cotton was also a major industry in the Grane Valley. Heapclough Mill, which ceased production around 1905, was the largest of 3 in the area. The other 2 mills were Broad Holden and Clough Head, which were originally driven by water power. The sites of both of these mills are now covered by Ogden Reservoir. Clough Head Reservoir was built between 1854 and 1859 to supply drinking water to Bury and Radcliffe. Use of local water supplies in towns risked the spread of waterborne diseases like typhoid and dysentery. This resulted from pollution of drinking water from open sewers, middens and cesspits. So a remote site was chosen in order that contamination of the water by human activities might be kept to a minimum. Hartley House and the nearby cottages are some of the many ruins to be found in this valley. The remains of the buildings have been excavated and stabilised to show their layout. In 1800, handloom weaving of wool or cotton was thriving in places such as this, but by 1880 it had ceased, as factories with looms powered by steam engines came to the fore. Notice the remains of an old walled track that climbs steeply up the hill to join Stony Rake, which was the main route through the valley before a turnpike, Trost, built Grane Road. Can you imagine huddled figures trudging up there on an icy morning, laden with cloth to sell? Hartley House dates back to Elizabethan times and took its name from the family that built it. It began as a single farmhouse, but by the 1790s, another farm and 4 cottages joined it. The Hartleys farmed cows, horses and sheep, grew oats and made cloth. John Lord, who lived at one of the farms in 1881, was a clogger, while his neighbour, William Greenwood, was a quarryman. They both also farmed. Their children were sent tenting, helping weavers at Heapclough Mill. Hartley House was abandoned in 1900. The last recorded activity was an account for payments to haymakers in 1899. Lower Arm Rods dates to the 16th century. It was made from Haslingden flagstone, quarried locally. Lower Arm Rods was owned by the Ormrod family in the 16th and 17th century. They were one of the wealthiest families in Grane and owned several farms on the hillside. John Ormrod was the last family member to be connected to the property, which he sold in 1746. In the 19th century, Lower Ormerods was home to the Kenyon family, who produced textiles. At first, they had a loom shop built at the back of the property, and later, many members of the family became power loom weavers at Clough Mill. The construction of Clough Head and Ogden reservoirs in 1854 and 1903, respectively, sealed the fate of Lower Ormerods, as the reservoirs flooded the better farmland in the area, and the Bury and Radcliffe Waterworks Company bought the upper reaches of the valley and terminated the leases of the cottages and farms to prevent contamination of the water supply. Clough Head and Heathcliff mills also had to close, and this led to the abandonment of the village between 1890 and 1920. During its later stages of occupation, Lower Ormerods reverted back to being a small holding. The western wings became barns and the loom shop a pigsty. The last recorded date of occupation was 1899. In the early 1800s, the Ormerod family sold the property to Lawrence Taylor of Constable in Rawtenstall. He modified the building for handloom weaving before the next owner, Ellis Ratcliffe, built long loom shops across the rear of the farm after 1790. Crosby describes how Lower Ormerods developed into a weaving hamlet. He notes that when grain was really thriving in 1841, the Kenyon family at Lower Ormerods were involved in not only farming and handloom weaving, but spinning at Clough Head Mill and quarrying on both sides of the valley. 19 years later, thanks to the Water Board, all that was about to change. As with Hartley House, the last land was farmed at Lower Ormerods in 1899. In the fields above, almost unrecognisable, are the remains of Higher Ormerods, a later farm from the time when the hamlet had been really flourishing. It was once the childhood home of the whisky spinner Jonathan Howarth of Bentley House, a claim, if anything, to infamy. Interpretation boards have been placed at both Lower Ormerods and Hartley House, and a good hour can be spent at each in order to make sense of the layout. Both were built by wealthy yeoman farmers, being reduced in status and divided up as the population increased and land use changed, handloom weaving eventually superseding farming, and both eventually succumbed to the needs of the water authorities. In this way, their ruins stand symbolic, chronicling the sombre history of Haslingden Grane for all to see. I just want to add some of my commentary now while we are looking around Lower Ormerods. The book by Stephen Oldfield is very good, but the only thing I don't like about it is kind of a villainisation of the Water Board. It says the Water Board eyed greedily the land. I get what he's saying, like, it is sad what happened to the grain, but what the Water Board did was very important. I mean, in the same book he complains about the infant mortality back then and the waterborne diseases and things, and it's because of the people who built the reservoirs that we have clean water. And you know what people did in the 19th century to improve the country, it was at the expense of like people like the Graners, but it was necessary. I think the writer of the book knows that. It's just, yeah, it is a romantic place and it's a romantic book, but it is very good. But yeah, I just want to add my appreciation to the Water Board. You know, he says, I can't find the paragraph I was going to reference, but he talks about the hard-working population living in terror of the Water Board, like taking more of their land. Yeah, there wasn't much to fall back on in them days, but the Water Board were also hard working. I mean, the building of the reservoir and the advancement towards a much healthier society. They're the real heroes, I think. But the hard-working farmers of the Grane, I have pity for them as well. Because, back in them day, people weren't properly compensated, I imagine. But they were tough, so I'm sure they turned their hands to other work and found a way to live, because people always seemed to do that back then. On the first day, I filmed these ruins, the reservoir, and then I went to search for Bentley House, the home of Jonathan Holden. Was it Jonathan Holden or Jonathan Howarth? Which is in the woods now. It wasn't in the woods when it was built, but now it's in the woods. Which makes it even more interesting, because it's very hard to find compared to the other ruins. So I'm off to look for that. But I had to come back and film the house the next day. And then I had a totally windless day when I filmed the main road towards Blackburn, where the most substantial ruins are. So that's upcoming. Okay, Stephen Oldfield's book has 4 pages about Bentley House, so he really likes that one. So while I'm stumbling around in the woods, I'll read that. But first, let me tell you about the Fairy Glen, which is a higher up part of this wood that I'm in now. As the legend goes, Oberon, king of the fairies, was seeking a summer residence, and for some reason he fancied the idea of Lancashire. Presumably, no one had warned him about typical June and July weather in northern parts. He promptly dispatched his faithful Silverwing, who discovered this exquisitely beautiful tributary of the Ogden, cascading between delicately sculpted walls encrusted with mosses, ferns, and liverworts. Oberon immediately claimed it for himself, and it is said that in midsummer, when the sun is at its zenith, the little people can be seen making their way up between the narrow walls of rock, where they congregate by the waterfall and pool. There they pay homage to their king and his wife, Titania, sitting in splendour in the Fairy Glen. The Graners of old had a far less romantic view of the glen. Until the early 19th century, it was known as Hellhoyle, with many in fear of visiting its dark confines. The presence of adders, toads, and fly-agaric mushrooms can have only reinforced their trepidation. This so concerned a local clergyman that he's said to have renamed the Fairy Glen based on the old legend. From then on, many Victorians, in full clobber and long skirts, would clamber along the stream, posing for photographs in places that had once petrified their grandparents. What wonder that a late clergyman of this moorland parish found his way and spent his hours of meditation within the cool and shadow of this retreat. Mather describes the Clough as the holy place, but not the Holy of Holies. This, in his opinion, is reached by following the course of the stream above the cascade, where a second fall of waters is encountered. We ascend this mossy stairway of the Naiads, and once upon its landing, stand within their home. Here dwells, amid the silence of its music and the solitude of its companionship, the spirit of the stream. Spirits and Naiads aside, Mather actually refrains from calling the Clough Fairy Glen, sparking confusion as to which of the 2 main cloughs cutting the hillside is actually the one named by the clergyman. 2 late Victorian or Edwardian postcards are to blame, and both are labelled Fairy Glen. One shows a finely dressed gentleman posing by the waterfall at the site Mather described, above Grane Head, with the other clearly shows Hog Low Clough on the opposite side of Bentley House, just to the east. Probably a house here too. I have traversed this clough top to bottom, and while it is undoubtedly beautiful, I can see no evidence of why it would be seen as a hellhole. There is no narrow ravine, nor any sign of a significant pool or waterfall. There are, however, long-eared owls, which make Hog Low Clough a special place for bird watchers. To some, however, perhaps this lovely clough will always be their idea of a fairy's home. Being faced with little other than contrasting evidence, perhaps we should leave the final decision to the fairies themselves. Little remains of Grane Head, except the distinctive stone gateposts overlooking piles of moss-covered rubble. It was once a significant hamlet. Worship here actually predates the 1815 Methodist chapel in Grane Village. George Duckworth is known to have knocked the attics of the properties into one long room for services, and it's hard to believe there was once even a schoolroom here, night classes being taught by an eccentric local known as Owd Pickup. A separate book could describe the plethora of Grane characters. Fairy Glen is fed from streams on the western slopes of Hog Low Pike, where many flint tools and scrapers have been recovered over the years. The proximity of this activity is no coincidence, for it is likely that this dramatic natural water feature had great significance to the ancient people, perhaps for sacred or ritual purposes. I don't believe it's any higher than this. There are a gate post there, but this is too high. I could not find the moonshiner's house. I don't know where I'm going wrong. I'll have to research and come back. But there's also a big chimney up there in a hole on top of the hill in an old quarry. And then there's a little tunnel through the hillside, small one. And then you come round to Musbury. So I'll have to go there. There's a lot of ruins there. But I'll come back and try and find that moonshiner house another time. It's in that woods. You can't see it till you're on it, but I had a really good look. I didn't think it were that hard to find. I must be remembering wrong. A strong candidate for the most atmospheric of all the ruined farmhouses in Rosendale, Bentley House, with its superb 17th century mullioned windows, is hidden in thick trees, covered to the south of Clough Head Reservoir. Few are aware of it, and many who walk their dogs regularly around Clough Head will have never seen it. Full summer foliage completely conceals the ruin from all but a few souls who know its exact location, while even in winter its colours so match the surrounding tree trunks and branches that it can be difficult to pick out. These are the reasons, no doubt, for its impressive survival. Once owned by the prosperous Bentley family, who probably rebuilt on the site of an earlier structure in the 17th century, the building contains several loom shops. Its size and elaborate design indicate the abode of a wealthier yeoman farmer. The house was once connected to Grane village by an old track, now submerged beneath Clough Head reservoir, and since rerouted across the reservoir dam, it is likely that considerable pack horse traffic once came this way, and the massive stone gate post at the farm's entrance merits a close inspection. This appears to be of great age, and may even predate the current farm building. On it are carved the words, "To Bolton," in clear capitals, making this possibly the oldest road sign in Rosendale. There are other faint carvings on the stone, and JH can definitely be deciphered in good light. This has always excited me, for here we could have the initials of one of Grane's most famous characters, and more or less right on his doorstep. Jonathan Haworth, 1831 to 1895, moved into Bentley House in 1854, clearly with more than farming and handling weaving on his mind. The distilling of illicit whiskey, or moonshine, in the remote corners of the Grane Valley was nothing new. As far back as 1805, a secret still room had been built into the farmhouse at Far Pike Law, but Jonathan seems to have taken things to a new level of ingenuity. Whiskey spinning, as it was known, was a convenient way to supplement the farm income, and an even easier way of escaping from the hardships of its living. It was also strictly illegal, avoiding the heavy tax imposed on spirits by the government. Farmers from the Haslingden Musbury areas, and especially from the Grane Valley, were rumoured to be spinning so much of it that from 1834 an excise officer was based in Haslingden to try and put a stop to it. He already suspected that illicit whiskey was being smuggled from Grane to the public houses of Haslingden, often stored in hollowed-out saddles of donkeys and well hidden by whatever else the animal was carrying. Picture the scene, then, at 11 p.m, precisely on the evening of Friday the 3rd, April 1857, inside Bentley House. Jonathan Haworth was probably ready to turn in for the night, no doubt pleased with himself after a busy evening's spinning. There was little to worry about. It was all cleverly concealed, and surely no arm of the law would reach out to this remote spot, even if they suspected all was not as it should be. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a hammering at the door. Standing there was Ellis Heath, supervisor of the Inland Revenue in Blackburn, with a number of officers. Tipped off by a mysterious informant, they began immediately to head for the square loom shop, in which they found only the looms themselves, no sign of whiskey. Going upstairs, they noticed the room above was considerably bigger than the one they had just visited below, and returned suspiciously. One of them tapped at the wall, asking Haworth what lay behind it. He informed them that it was the outside gable end. Only then did they notice that the mortar was unusually soft. Looking down, they saw the stone slab floor had been very recently laid. They demanded that Haworth lift the flags so they could see underneath. At this point he must have realised the game was up, but what a game it was. What Heath and his cronies found at Bentley House astonished them. Below the flagstones was an arched opening, hewn out of the solid rock, and just big enough to allow a man to crawl through. Beyond this was an underground room, stone-lined, and with a fireplace and whiskey still at one end. The Blackburn Standard noted that they found a new still, and every apparatus requisite for the manufacture of illicit spirits. Most ingeniously, Haworth had used a length of piping to connect the fireplace beneath the floor of the loom shop and up into the main chimney of the house, so only one flue could be seen to emit smoke. The stone that was hewn out to make the secret passage had even been used to build the false wall in the loom shop, cleverly concealing the chimney flue connection behind it. This was a man who clearly knew what he was doing. Haworth was arrested and heavily fined. He is said to have sold 10 head of cattle, as well as his house, to pay his fines, and when this proved insufficient, he was imprisoned with hard labour. By 1861, though, he was a free man, living at the even more remote Peak Farm to the west of the reservoir. The experience doubtless did little to deter him, for in the original St. Stephen's churchyard at Grane he lies beneath an elaborate gravestone, which must have cost, as they say in the valley, an arm and a leg. How he made so much money in his later years is not difficult to imagine. He lies with his wife Alice, who he survived by 15 years, though tragically their 3 children all died in infancy, son Robert at only 14 days old. There is, however, something rather defiant about the tombstone, still standing in a beautiful spot despite the removal of the church and the changes all around it. A final snigger, perhaps, at the excisemen after such a tumultuous life. Somebody up there likes the old whisky spinner. Between Pike Low and Rushy Hill, Grane Road reaches its highest point before dropping steadily towards Blackburn. Here, then, is the remote and exposed western frontier of the Rosendale Valley, a place equally suitable for Bronze Age burial and illicit whisky distilling. The remoteness of the farm at Far Pike Low escaped the attention of the excisemen for some half a century, before James Morris's antics were finally tipped off by a not-so-mysterious informer. Alice Haworth's husband, Jonathan, had been arrested for the same offence at Bentley House just a year before, and she was clearly overcome with bitterness. Why should Morris continue to get away with it while her husband was languishing in prison? There's just one theory. Otherwise, people have suggested someone in the Morris family, perhaps jealous of the competition at Bentley House, tipped off the Haworths to the authorities. Alice may well have been exacting her revenge. So it was that on the 25th of August 1859, Excise Supervisor Mr. Heath, with 2 Inland Revenue officers, set out for a morning raid on Far Pike Low. Men who had apparently seen it all under the astonishing sight that awaited them. Morris must have known they were coming when the officials entered the house. They found him reading the Bible and lifting his eyes to the ceiling and proclaiming, "I'm as innocent as a child unborn." As they began to search and dig around the property for evidence, they didn't notice that Morris had suddenly disappeared, in a vain attempt to destroy his incriminating apparatus. After several days, the men discovered lead pipes leading into a subterranean cavern, accessed from the stone floor above through a manhole. It was covered by a moving slab, which ran on rails, the slightest movement on one corner causing it to roll aside and reveal the secret entrance. The room contained a still, built into the floor with 100 gallons of whisky, 5 jars full of a further 10 gallons, and 3 tin cans that could hold a further 30 to 40 gallons. The lead pipes carried water into the place from a well 100 yards away, and there was a drainer that fitted so tight that not a particle of steam could escape. Mr. Heath and his cronies then noted that the destroyed worms, or copper pipes, realising Morris must have gone down by the trap while they were searching the premises. Instead, he found himself with a massive £200 fine, an extortionate amount in 1858, and he had to sell up to pay it, as well as spending some time in prison at Her Majesty's pleasure. 46-year-old Morris had been born around 1812, and astonishingly revealed to the magistrates that the still had been put in place by his late father as early as 1805. The whisky, which was of superior quality, had been smuggled inside the hollow saddles of pack horses to pubs in Haslingden and Blackburn. In summing up the raid on Farpike Low, Heath said he had never seen such a place in all his years of experience, and reckoned the government had been defrauded out of an eye-watering £700 a year for at least half a century. The Grane whisky spinners didn't do things by halves. As with Jonathan Howarth at Bentley House, Morris had the last laugh. Just 3 years later he was out and working as an engine tender at Clough Head mill, when the mill was demolished around 1910 to build Ogden Reservoir. Surprise, surprise, there was a large whisky distillery found beneath the mill floor. The habits of a lifetime die hard. At Farpike Low today, there is a suspiciously large well, behind which is the obvious entrance to the underground distillery. This can't be the well mentioned in the court case, which was 100 yards away, but may have been connected with the illicit distilling in some way. It is even possible to see a small length of stone flooring above the entrance, and this is real history, rough, ready, and there for all to see. The old highway through the valley runs northward from here as Stony Rake, passing an area of mounds and humps known as slate pits. The stone isn't slate, of course, but Haslingden flag, a kind of sandstone that lies very close to the surface and splits easily into slabs in a similar way to slate. When it was first mined and quarried here is unclear, but even in 1662 it was described as being leased to Edward Kippax and almost worn out. We are looking here at possibly late medieval workings. Where Stony Rake meets Grane Road at Turf Pits, there once stood a pub known as the Hare and Hounds, probably a former farm that had been converted to a watering hole for the quarry workers. It had a smithy attached, which apparently did a roaring trade. Clive Seal tells me that in 1819 the smith himself was arrested for making pikes for the Bolton Reform meeting that followed the Peterloo massacre. If there was any chance for a dig at the establishment in times gone by, the Graners seem to have been first in the queue. He was described simply as a rough country blacksmith, and the ruined walls of his smithy still can be made out in the undergrowth today. They must have a few tales to tell. The old road continues towards Pike Low to pass Alley Cross. The foundations of a group of buildings can be seen here on the left of the route, and the name is believed to be a corruption of Holy Cross. A stone cross probably stood here long before the hamlet was built, and it may have been a continuation of the route to Whalley Abbey from Holden Cross, lying about 3 kilometres to the east. The most intriguing object in the ruins is a shallow trough or basin, carved from a single block of sandstone, with obvious markings on each of its faces. It lies on its sides and is often missed by passers-by, but is well worth a close inspection. Did this basin once serve as part of a holy well by the cross that presumably stood here? Was it used to deposit offerings, relics, or tokens on a pilgrimage? Was it later moved and used for a different purpose? All are worth considering when reviewing this wonderful old object. The 1851 census shows no less than 49 people living at this exposed location out on the moors. Thompson, Barnes, Birtwistle, Ashcroft, Holden, and inevitably Haworth are the dominant surnames. The fact that 3 houses were uninhabited gives an idea of the size of the families. They were mostly weavers, spinners, and quarry workers, who presumably kept the landlords of the Hare and Hounds busy on a daily basis. Bizarre events made the headlines at Alley Cross in November 1944. A local farmer named Nutter noticed wisps of smoke coming from the old pigsty and decided to investigate. He was met with 2 suspicious-looking men with foreign accents and dressed in civilian clothes. Karl Hanickel and Ernst Goller were Nazi airmen who had escaped from the Wharf prisoner of war camp at Bury just a few days before. They were unshaven, grimy, and had between them a loaf, margarine, and a few rashers of bacon. Nutter's suspicions were confirmed when one of them asked him how far it was to the nearest aerodrome. Within hours, police threw a cordon around the area, and with the help of the Home Guard, the Alley Cross squatters were recaptured and taken back to Bury. According to the Rosendale Free Press, frightened local housewives who had heard rumours of the Bury breakout could now sleep more soundly in their beds. There is no footpath to the summit of Pike Low itself, and even the easiest way is an obstacle course of bogs, knee-deep rushes, and dodgy cows. But it is worth it at least once for the fabulous views westward towards the Fylde coast. This is the first high ground that clouds rolling eastwards over the Fylde will eventually encounter. 368 metres above sea level. As Low so often suggests, there is evidence here of a possible Bronze Age barrow. The walls running northwards appearing to ride up over it, just as it does at the excavated cairn of Wind Hill near Heywood. I don't think Pike Low has ever been recorded as an official site, perhaps because it is rarely visited, but it seems an obvious one to me. The fact that the cairns form a perfect isosceles triangle with both 13 Stone Hill and Hoglaw Pike is surely no coincidence. There appears to have been some ancient geometry at work here. If only we could strip away the peat and see what lies beneath. In the later half of the 19th century, this remote farmhouse was locally famous as the home of Aud Andry, or Andrew Scholes, a great eccentric usually referred to as the Grane Hermit or Miser. Crosby describes him as the greatest of all the Grane characters, and his appearance seems to have matched his maverick nature, though no photographs of him are known to exist. A man who remembered him is quoted in Graham Revisited, saying he wore short breeches. One of the legs of the breeches was a foot longer than the other. The colour should have been black, but it was green, with Andrew cowering over the fire. He had big Garth iron clogs. His waistcoat was buttoned from the middle to the top. One of the buttons at the back of his coat was higher up than the others. His shirt was open at the neck. He was a tall, slim man and had whiskers under his chin. As befits so many eccentrics, Aud Andry was multi-talented, brilliant with his hands, an exceptional musician, as well as having a way with words. At each beef neat, following the slaughtering of a cow at one of the nearby farms, he was often called upon to play the fiddle, sing and recite poetry. In the yard of Top at Knoll, there once stood a stone slab on which he had carved the verse, "Happy the man, the only happy man, that out of choice doth all good he can, who business leaves and others better make, by the prudent industry and the pains he takes, while he lives he's man's esteem, and when he dies his fame will follow him." I have searched in vain for this poem over many visits, sometimes kidding myself that I can see faint letters on a flat slab outside the farm in certain light, but I would love to find this stone or know what has become of it. It seems a great pity that it is no longer there, as a permanent memorial to Aud Andry. But by far the best known story about the Grey Miser concerns his famous cart. Andrew had apparently spent all his spare time building a beautiful vehicle in his parlour, adding refinements and adjustments until the time came to take it outside. When he found it wouldn't fit through the doorway, he refused to dismantle it or demolish the doorway, so there it stood, reared on its side, still without wheels. The story of the cart spread far and wide, and curious travellers came over the moor from as far afield as Bolton and Blackburn to view it. Methodist minister and writer J. Marshall Mather, writing in 1888, was one. The moment he saw us, he beat a hasty retreat, but a few coppers won him over. We entered and beheld upon the threshold the remains of what had once been a man, a tall, round-shouldered, hairy-visaged monster with a twinkling eye and a leering look, half scared and half savage, with face all seamed with lines of dirt and age. A three-legged table, bearing an earthen pot and spoon, stood in the middle of the windowless room, the space between the jambs being built up with stones. Against the wall, a cart without wheels was reared on its side, which Andrew in his spare time had constructed within the dwelling, and for which he had not found no use. Alone he had lived for 50 years. This is possibly true. At the 1841 census, Andrew Scholes is alone at Top of Knoll, giving his age as 25. 10 years later he is supposedly 37, staying with his mother, Jane, and sibling, Joseph, at Hill End Farm in Edgeworth. With each succeeding census, he is back at Top of Knoll, his given age never quite coinciding with the 10-year gap. He is 45 in 1861, 50 in 1871, and 65 10 years later. From this we can conclude that he had no idea of his actual birth date. Research shows that he was the son of William and Jenny Scholes, was born in Edgeworth, and was baptised at St Mary's Church, Blackburn, on 13th of April 1814. He did, for the most part, live alone, and certainly never married. The only exception seems to have been in 1861, when 9 people lived at Top of Knoll, the others being the family of quarryman Lawrence Greenwood. Though of course, the farm could have been split into 2 separate dwellings. Mather concludes that his friend told him Andrew came of a fairly good family from Edgeworth side, and from his youth he had been of seclusive habits, and over some trifling dispute left his home and friends to follow a solitary moorland life. His friends were only too anxious to assist him, but all their proffers were to no avail. Mathers also relates how a fee of 6pence tempted Andrew to bring out his celebrated violin, the Merry Bit of Timber. When settling himself down upon the remains of a chair, he drew the bow across the strings and sung some moorland ditty. The great character's life did not end happily. By 1891, Andrew was a 77-year-old pauper at the Haslingden Union Workhouse, listed as a cotton weaver, alongside others variously described as idiots, imbeciles, and lunatics, in the uncompromising tones of Victorian England. Perhaps fortunately for him, he endured this miserable existence just a few years, dying in March 1892 at the age of 78, though his given age is 80. I wonder what he'd think if he could see a full chapter devoted to him in the mystical moors 130 years later. The concluding line of his poem, "When he dies, his fame will follow him," could not be more appropriate. Nearby, along the same line of springs to the north, are 2 more interesting ruined farms. Peak, which in 1861 was the home of Jonathan Howarth, the notorious whisky distiller, formerly of Bentley House, with Close Bottom just beyond. The latter has 3 square windows looking out over the valley, and an interesting cellar beneath. 13 members of the Entwistle family lived here in 1861, mainly employed as cotton weavers. Peak itself was empty by 1881, and after 1898, the Water Board began to buy all the farms in the Upper Grane Valley to prevent pollution of the catchment. By 1920, all the major farms had been abandoned. Their ruins stand as memorial to another life in another time, as far away as the trappings of the 21st century as it's possible to imagine. Indeed, I wonder just what Aud Andrew and his fellow grainers would have made of us.